Well, a number of folks throughout the week told me they thought repeatedly, or at least more than once, about the leaf blowing incident that I shared last week. And for those of you who weren't here, you might have missed out on this. My not so gentle approach to the house that is adjacent to the church building here, where the man was blowing leaves on our side of the fence. And I'm grateful that you remembered the story, though as the conversation continued with some of you, I realized that you didn't hear anything after the story. You couldn't remember the rest of the sermon, and some people later in the week couldn't remember what the sermon was about. I think it was about anger, someone said. So maybe I should have told the sermon used the story at the end rather than at the beginning, because the story somehow seemed to overpower the sermon. But all that to say is the leaf blowing incident prompted our new maintenance technician, Dave, who we're kind of enjoying working together, and he's loving being here at McKnight Crossing, and he was the one that went over and spoke Spanish to the fellow and helped me out. But Dave said, well, I think you need to retell the story again this week, because it applies to self-control just as well. That's our fruit for the day, self-control. And I thought to myself, since when does he have the right to point out my sins? Or is it, Dave, you just want to be the hero of the story again? I don't know. But in any event, the fruit of self-control, and how critically important that is, particularly as it enables the rest of the fruit to grow in our lives. Now, I have to also admit that last week there was this strange juxtaposition of things, and I don't know if you noticed it or not, of ideas, because the title of the sermon last week, as we were going through the fruit of the Spirit, was Cultivating Gentleness in a World of Aggression. This is on the title of our bulletin, and it all sounded good, but then there, right beside it, there's the title of our retreat, The Fight, which that in and of itself was a little awkward in terms of those two things coming together on the front of the bulletin. But then I go over to the gym service, and one of our elders shows up with boxing gloves as I'm trying to preach about gentleness. So again, this was this very strange amalgamation of things. But the men, we've had the retreat yesterday, and once again, Steve Autry put on the boxing gloves and the helmet at the retreat, and we talked about the fight, the spiritual battle that we are in. And I believe, in fact, that terminology, the fight, is a fitting transition to this week's passage as we look for just briefly at 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul insists that he does not fight like a man that is beating the air. And so the title of the message this morning is Cultivating Self-Control. And that is a fight in a world of addiction. Now, most ancient traditions speak extensively about the idea of self-control. It is highly valued. Why? Because most of those who thought about these things realize how weak we are as human beings and how quickly we are addicted to things, how enslaved we become. And Dave, I'm going to ask you, why don't we turn down the thermostats about 2 degrees? I don't know about you, but it feels about like it's getting a little warm up here. You getting it, Steve? Okay, you agree with me? 2 or 3 degrees. Thank you. How enslaved, long before Paul, the Greeks praised self-control. Socrates thought it was the foundational human virtue. In other words, he put it as number one. One of his students said it this way. He summarized Socrates. Shall not every man hold self-control to be the foundation of all virtue? And first firmly lay this foundation firmly in his soul. For who without this can learn any good or practice it worthily? Powerful idea from a student of Socrates. To the Greeks, it started with self-control, variously translated, sometimes temperance, moderation, continence. More recently in our English translation, self-control is the way we've spoken about it. Plato writes about this paradox to even talk about self-control, and in the Republic, and he says it this way: isn't this phrase of self-mastery rather absurd? I mean, anyone who is his own master is also his own slave. Of course, and vice versa, since it is the same person who is subject in all these expressions. And Plato talks about these noble and less noble parts of our person, and they are, to the title of the men's retreat, at war. And the question is, who is going to rule? So the Greeks took this very seriously and then to an extreme. And to master one's desire, to master oneself, meant to no longer be controlled by outside forces. If you can control who you are from within, then this freedom within was the highest ideal. And those who had the most control over their appetites and over their desires, in other words, self-mastery, were those who were controlled by their mind, by the rational person. And the most rational ones are the ones who are to run the republic. Was their logic, their thought process. Put the rational in charge. So given the widespread use of this word in the ancient world, it by comparison gets very relatively little attention in the New Testament text. But its opposite is everywhere. Think about the passages that talk about the flesh, about out-of-control worldly passions, about desires, about lusts, about this lack of self-control. They're all over the Bible. I had a friend who used to say, you know what, self-discipline is way overrated. And I think what he meant by that is who can keep it going? You know, it's about that time of year. If you made some New Year's resolution, how you doing? And sometimes we just don't even want to stop and think again about it because it's so indicting. Professional athletes, on the other hand, are very, very highly disciplined. They exercise, they work out, they practice, they practice, they practice. They got to get up early. It's interesting because at the same time, while they are so disciplined in some areas of their life, it seems to me they're always in the news. Now, I don't know about all of them, but you don't have to look very far to see they're getting drunk, they're getting high, they're getting arrested, there are sexual assault charges, there are rape charges, there's an entire lawsuit right now against the football team at Baylor University. Now, I don't know if it's all true or not, but it's just interesting. How does a whole football team get indicted on all this thing when these are some of the most disciplined people in the world in terms of their athleticism and their sport? So yeah, self-discipline can be kind of overrated. Is there any really such thing? And so the New Testament writers, I think, to a degree, understood what my friend was saying. And what the Bible says then, and it's unlike the Greeks, and it's unlike life is not just a free-for-all, they saw a new power that comes through Christ and the Holy Spirit of God. And it's this power that needs to be drawn upon. It's not so much within us in the traditional way that we think about self-control or self-mastery, but it is self-control through the Spirit of Christ. And so the key verse that surrounds this section in Galatians 5, first Galatians 6 5:16 that precedes this one where we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit and self-control says this, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." And then on the other side of our section on the fruit of the Spirit is another passage that's much like it. In 24 and 25, it says this. So there's a little sandwich here where he's talking about the Spirit and denying the flesh as the way to bear the fruit of self-control. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. And since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Do you see how Paul's logic and argument and what he's trying to say about the power of the Spirit of God is different from maybe we have predictably defined or traditionally defined self-control? That's the main point that I'm trying to make in this section. And so when we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verses 24 and 27 that Bernie read to us, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. I believe the window of understanding of self-control in the New Testament begins to open up with a passage like this one in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Are you with me? Okay. First, this section is not about your salvation. Paul is not talking in the context here so much about salvation. He is talking about his ministry. Likewise, it's about our ministry, our purpose, the purpose, and then he uses this analogy of the Olympic athletes as a way to get there, and I suspect that you, like me, love the Olympics. Go ahead and put our slide there up. I don't know, you might remember the Final Five as the U.S. team dominated the gymnastics in Rio and led by these beautiful young ladies. And there is something about these Olympic events that do the best at drawing together the nation, and it speaks for all of us. And there are such incredible stories of dedication and sacrifice, and it's just stirring when you hear the detail. And it seems to me that athletics is one of the few areas of our society where we encourage self-control and discipline. Think about that for just a minute. Most of our areas of our culture basically conveyed to us, do what feels good. And so eating, shopping, driving, entertainment, watching TV, even in our relationships, do what feels good. So there's something else at work in athletics, and particularly you can see it with these Olympic athletics, and Paul draws on that metaphor. Getting up early, eating right, working out, learning new skills over and over and over and over so that you can perform when you need to perform, and nothing feels good. I won't say nothing, but a lot of that doesn't feel good at the time that you're doing that. But what I want you to see in the text is that the exercise is intentional with a purpose. There's a reason behind it, there's a goal in mind, and this purposefulness is contrasted with running aimlessly. So I'm not telling you this morning, I guess, to relate it to self-control, just be self-controlled. But be self-controlled for a reason. Run and discipline yourself for a reason. Because there's a goal and there's an end in mind, and if it's not your salvation, then what is it? And you need to wrestle with that. And you need to think about that. Athletes cannot afford to be distracted by every passion or desire or interest that comes along their way. We're not, remember Forrest Gump? We don't just run to run. We don't just train aimlessly. We don't fight aimlessly, but we're purposeful, intentional, and goal-directed, and this makes our life very, very different from unbelievers. I don't mean that we get it worked out or that we suddenly become self-disciplined, and because even Paul would say, well, I don't do what I want to do, and I do what I don't want to do. And so we seem to be trapped in that, maybe to the day we die. But the point is, we're raising our family with a purpose. We are working with a purpose. We are helping others with this purpose. We do it for the purpose of pleasing God. We do it for the purpose of His glory and His honor, and it is very intentional. And this makes our self-control quite different from the secular person, and our definition of self-control different from someone who is an unbeliever. Their self-control is for themselves. Our self-control is for the honor and glory of God. So here's my definition. It's a little amplified, if you will, but you might try this out. Self-control is the power through Christ to control oneself by dying to self for the sake of the gospel, the good news of God. Wow, there's a lot in these fruit of the Spirit, aren't there? You know, we just see them, we kind of read them, and we think, okay, fruit of the Spirit. I mean, plummet the depths of that. Take the rest of our life. And as Christians, then, we run. We don't sit, we don't talk, we don't walk, we run. And this was early on in Paul's ministry. He was running this race because he was clear about where he was going, and at the very close of his ministry, just shortly before he dies, as he writes 2 Timothy, he is still running, and he says, I have fought the fight, I have finished the race. We run for the crown, for God's approval, for God's glory, and for God's honor, to get the prize, as he says here, well done, thou good and faithful servant. For the sake of the gospel, he says in chapter 9 and verse 23 of 1 Corinthians. We didn't read that section, but there's a little hint. He says that for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. And for that reason, I need to be self-controlled. So we control ourselves because God controls us by His Spirit with this very different outcome to His honor and glory. So let me say it this way in a couple of applications. Philip Kennison concludes, if the Spirit brings to harvest the first 8 fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, then this final fruit will also be among the harvest. Now, it's interesting, and we could speculate, and we've got some folks that would enjoy doing it, but I'm not going to take a whole lot more time today. But why, then, would the fruit of the Spirit be put last? Why would self-control be listed last? If the Greeks saw it as the very first thing, and the first and foundational virtue, then somehow in God's Christian economy, things are turned upside down where love leads. And love sums it all up. And so maybe there are ways in which the self no longer is at the center at all in the Christian gospel. And so we might say, well, maybe it's just the self-control is the least important. I don't know if that's it, just because it's number 9, that it's the least important. But maybe it, along with love, becomes the most important, providing a bookend to the fruit of the Spirit. And in fact, without the self-control, it's pretty difficult to have the rest of the fruit grow in your life. Maybe Paul just writes without any thought to his order, or maybe self-control is there so that these other fruit can grow up, or maybe self is dethroned and uprooted and it now moves from first to last and he gets a complete facelift. And you might have some other theories, I don't know. But all of that, church, we are not born with this self-discipline. We cannot manufacture it. It is born of God, and it comes as a gift as a result of a relationship with God, and it grows as we claim the grace of God. Remember what Paul says in Titus 2, that the grace of God has appeared, and it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and to lead self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. A fruit of the grace of God in our life. Ben Franklin expressed in his frustration on this whole self project. He was trying to get to self-discipline. And he described it in his autobiography. And he says these words, "I would conquer all." Again, he was in a fight. "That either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into, as I knew or thought I knew what was right and what was wrong. I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other." In other words, why couldn't I, as a rational person, make these choices and do what was right and not do what was wrong? Then he said, "But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. And while my attention was taken up and care employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another." Who hasn't lived that one? Habit took advantage of inattention, and inclination was too strong for reason. What is Franklin saying? He's basically saying, I don't do what I want to do, and I do what I don't want to do. What Paul said. And so with this bootstrap spirituality, Franklin was attempting to develop a spiritual virtue through resolution and human strength, and he says, I can't get there. We need the gospel. So isn't it interesting when Bernie reads from the Acts chapter 24 passage? It was a remarkable passage where Paul proclaims the gospel to Felix, who is the ruler, and Felix and as a part of the gospel of God, he says, Felix, you need self-control. Now, Felix, the Roman governor, had stolen Drusilla from her husband, also a ruler, and Paul challenges his immorality and his self-control, and he says righteousness and the self-control are the fruit of faith, is really what Paul is getting at. He ties the gospel with self-control. And you know what Felix did? Maybe we have that passage? Not sure if we put it up there again. It says he listened to Paul, and then he said, Paul, get out of here. He sent him away. He hardened his heart, and then eventually lost his rule, and he left Paul in prison. My question this morning to you is, I know you, because I know myself, that most of us are embarrassed and we are guilty and we are ashamed because we are so weak. And some of us have been in the faith for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. And rather than moving in the direction of trusting God's Spirit, we would rather cover and connive than get started in this process of allowing God to bear fruit in our lives. And so this takes serious reflection and prayer. And believe me, it is a fight, warfare. And it's no wonder that Ed Welch in his book says it this way. So we are promised the gift of self-control, yet we must also take it by force. In other words, denying ourself. And so we, like Paul, need to train like Olympic athletes with a purpose, growing in self-discipline for a reason. We are competing for a crown that will last forever. I have no reason and no interest in being disqualified for the prize. How about you?